Hi, I'm Peter Jansen, an assistant professor at the University of Arizona, and I'd like to talk a bit today about the challenges associated with evaluating compositional explanations for question answering, and in particular how automated methods appear to be vastly underestimating model performance. So what is multi-hop inference in the context of question answering and explanation reconstruction? Essentially, as we see here, given a question, multi-hop inference requires combining two or more atomic facts from a corpus or a knowledge base that, when you take them together, they answer the question and they explain the reasoning behind that answer. In this study, we use science exam questions, and here's sort of a cartoon example on this slide of multi-hop inference that fits nicely on a single slide. The explanation is pretty simple, and it has only 3 facts. The question is, an animal has 6 legs. What is it most likely to be? The answer is a fly. And the 3-fact explanation is, a fly is a kind of insect, an insect has 6 legs, and an insect is a kind of animal. And how we normally evaluate this model-generated explanation to see if it's correct is to compare it against some gold explanation in the corpus to see if it selects all 3 of these gold facts. And just by the way, these explanations come from the World Tree corpus of compositional science explanations. Now, the typical modeling paradigm that most of us use when we try to generate a model that does better at the task, that generates better, more detailed explanations, looks something like this diagram here. First, we brainstorm our great new idea, then we implement it, and then finally we evaluate the performance of that model on the explanation generation task, usually automatically. Then, if our model performs better than the baseline model, life is good, we write up the paper and we submit it somewhere. But much more commonly, of course, the idea doesn't work. We go back to the drawing board and sort of wash, rinse, repeat until our automatic evaluation shows that we've come up with an idea that advances the state of the art. The problem with this, to quote Bilbo Baggins from The Hobbit, is that all that is gold does not glitter. The evaluation, or sort of the standard evaluation practice in the field right now, is to have a single gold explanation for each question, mostly because it's expensive to generate the data. Evaluation is then done by comparing against that single gold explanation. And so if your model generates a different explanation that's different than the gold one, but it's still good, you won't be able to automatically detect it. As an example of this, here's a question and a 4-fact explanation. The question is, when trees are cleared from the land, what will most likely occur? The answer is soil erosion. And the 4-fact gold explanation in the World Tree corpus is, a tree is a kind of plant. Roots are the part of a plant. In the soil erosion process, plant roots are an inhibitor, and removing an inhibitor causes a process to happen. Now, here's an explanation for this question that one of the models in this paper generated. In this case, it's the TensorFlow ranking BERT model. It's a 5-fact explanation, and it's soil erosion is when wind or water remove soil or move soil. Tree roots decrease soil erosion. As deforestation increases, soil erosion will increase. Deforested area is where humans cut down trees, and clearing a forest means cutting down trees. And so as you can see, it's a good explanation and it answers the question correctly, but it doesn't contain any of the same atomic facts as the gold explanation. And so here, automatic evaluations that compare against gold explanations would rate this explanation as incorrect. But if we manually investigate it with an expert evaluation, we see it's not just correct, but it's probably actually quite good. And so then we have this question, what's the difference between automatic and manual evaluations for building explanations? Is it a big problem or is it a small problem? And how do we measure how big of a problem it is? And so here we operationalize it as a problem of measuring 2 quantities. First, relevance, and second, completeness. Relevance is a fact level measure here. It essentially says for each fact selected by a model, how relevant is that single fact towards building a detailed explanation? Completeness is sort of the full downstream evaluation. It's a compositional or explanation level measure, and it basically says, given the whole collection of facts that a model said should be in an explanation, if I take them all together, does it provide a good explanation for the question, or is it sort of missing critical facts? And I'll show an example of what that looks like in a second. And so the way that we measure this is essentially by brute force, by getting domain experts here, 3 science teachers with about 40 years of combined experience to generate about 250,000 expert ratings, 250,000 expert ratings from 3 teachers. It's a lot. but it helps us really get a very accurate measure of these quantities. So let's talk about relevance first. We measured relevance on a 4-point scale that on one end varies from core facts for explaining to the answer to the other end, which is sort of the facts aren't relevant at all. Here's some examples here rated by the teachers. We trained 2 strong retrieval models, one a BERT model, one a Roberta model, on picking out relevant facts for the explanations. And then for each question, we get them to generate a short list and then have the teachers rate the short list of the 30 highest scoring facts. We can see some of those facts here for an example question about fossil fuels causing acid rain. Facts like burning fossil fuels releases sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere are rated very highly relevant, and facts such as the air contains carbon dioxide are rated irrelevant, even though they're certainly related to pollution, but they're not related to the question here about acid rain. Note here that I'm only showing a small subset of the 30 facts that the teachers rated for this question. But the language models and the teachers are clearly sort of finding a lot more facts that are potentially relevant for building an explanation than were originally annotated as gold. The gold ones are sort of the 3 facts here with those stars beside them. So there's quite a bit more than is annotated in those single gold explanations. And just to drive that point home a little bit, this table here shows the original world tree rating for a given fact. It's binary, it's either in the explanation or it's not. So here we say gold or not gold, and that's versus the teacher ratings from this work, which is sort of the 0, 1, 2, or 3, not relevant to core. What we see here is that the teachers actually discovered 80,000 facts, or an average of about 18 per question, that are potentially relevant to building these detailed explanations, but that are not included in the gold explanation. That's 3 times the number of potentially relevant facts as were originally annotated in those single gold explanations. So in other words, automatic evaluation for explanations is likely going to be a big problem because models could be picking out lots of good and relevant facts that we're just not detecting because they're not included in that single gold explanation. And this is exactly what we see when we actually start evaluating the models on tasks. So to orient you a bit to this table, these are the results for 3 strong baseline models, the BERT, Roberta, and TensorFlow ranking BERT, on something called the explanation regeneration task. The specific details of the task are a bit too long to get into here, but what's important to know is that this is a standard task used in shared tasks for evaluating a model's ability to pick out relevant facts for explanation building. So it's basically evaluating relevance. It's also a ranking task, so the numbers here represent mean average precision. And what we see here, when we evaluate these models automatically in the standard way by comparing against the single gold explanation, that's the performance here in the baseline column, and then when we evaluate those same models using the more exhaustive teacher-generated manual ratings, the performance numbers we get are really different. Specifically, the difference scores between the baseline and the teacher evaluations is pretty large. It's anywhere between a 3 and a 14% difference depending on the model that you're looking at. Note here that we report 2 different teacher measures. One that basically says you can take all facts that the teacher is considered as even possibly relevant as okay to include in the explanation. That's that first column. And the second column just basically considers the most important facts. So this is problem number 1. Automatic evaluations are underestimating relevance by a pretty significant number. Problem number 2 is that this evaluation problem seems to affect different models disproportionately. What I mean by that is that the BERT model here has a difference of only 3 points between the automatic and manual evaluation, but the TFR BERT model has a huge 14-point difference. So if you were using an automatic evaluation, which again is standard, you'd think that the BERT baseline was 5 points higher than your much more computationally expensive TFR BERT model, when in fact the opposite is true. The manual evaluation shows TFR BERT is actually outperforming BERT by about 5 points. So not being able to properly sort of compare the performance of different models is obviously a huge methods problem, but it gets even worse, unfortunately. So let's switch gears and look at measuring explanatory completeness, so the full downstream task here of building explanations and are they good or are they not. The paper measures this in a bunch of different ways through a variety of different experiments. For simplicity here, I'm just going to focus on binary completeness. What I mean by that is that the judgment is either that the explanation is good or that it's not good because it's missing some critical and important facts. As an example of this, here's an example question about an ice cube melting and a hypothetical model-generated explanation. That explanation has plenty of relevant facts, but it misses some pretty important ones that are critical to explaining the answer. In this case, it misses the whole concept of melting, and so we would give this explanation a negative rating. We evaluated 3 very different kinds of models that generate full and complete explanations. The first is that TensorFlow ranking BERT model from the last task, which is a large language model that's been formulated as a ranking problem. The second is unified QA, which is this huge T5 model that has multitask pre-training on just a giant number of question answering datasets and formats that we also supply fine-tuning on building explanations to. So it's a generative sequence-to-sequence model instead of a ranking model. The last model is sort of a symbolic model that uses constraint satisfaction and a constraint satisfaction solver I built to generate solutions to these sort of multi-slot inference patterns or schemata that satisfy particular criteria over a knowledge base. And these schemas have sort of been automatically and manually generated from a database of explanations. So we have 3 intentionally very different models with 3 very different learning frameworks in them. And what we end up seeing is that the story is very much the same as it was in the relevance case, except that here with completeness, the difference scores are even larger. So on the left side, we have the models, unified QA, TFR BERT, and the schema model. The columns are, the first one is the automatic evaluation against the single gold explanation. That's what we normally do today. The second one is our manual evaluation of explanatory completeness. And the last one is the difference score. The difference scores, again, are huge here. The automatic and manual evaluations are producing scores that are between 23 and 36% different. And again, it's affecting different models disproportionately. The schema models only affected about 20%, but the language models are affected by about 35%. And so, of course, the bottom line here is that if you had evaluated these models automatically, you'd conclude something incorrect. You'd think that the TFR BERT model outperforms the schema model, and that the schema model outperforms the unified QA model by quite a bit. In reality, the manual evaluation shows that while TFR BERT is at the top in these cases, the schema model and the unified QA model are about the same. But more than that, that the actual performance of each of these models is very different than what you'd automatically estimated. The TFR BERT model is performing at about 72%, which is about double what its automatically measured performance is. And it's actually remarkably good at generating explanations for manual questions when you look at them. It's just that we weren't able to detect this and measure it properly previously. So, conclusions, where we are and where we're going. The bottom line here is that automatic evaluations are substantially underestimating model performance by up to 36%. It's also affecting different models disproportionately. So if you're trying to publish a model that's 2% better than the previous state of the art, or trying to review a paper that's 2% better than the previous state of the art, but now you know that both models have a 40% large error bar on them if they're evaluated automatically, how do we even measure performance anymore to do good science and know which models are better than others? And by the way, a perfectly valid criticism of this might be that maybe this is only the case on this data set. Maybe this is only the case for WorldTree and that other data sets are unaffected. Some collaborators and I have measured a difference of about 30% between automatic and manual performance on a different data set. And so I think that it's likely that it affects all large compositional data sets. And it's probably an artifact of us getting away from evaluating with more formal semantics like logics on large compositional problems. So I think the problem's here to stay. So what do we do about it? Potential solution number 1 is just to sort of throw more warm brains at the problem, right? And pay people to manually evaluate your models regularly. The problem with this is that it's fantastically expensive, it's very much slower than what we do today, and you're going to run into inter-annotator agreement issues, especially if you have a large collection of annotators that aren't experts. We had about 89% agreement on measuring completeness here, and that's using 2 domain experts, not crowdsourced workers. Potential solution number 2 is not to evaluate against one gold explanation, but to evaluate against multiple gold explanations. I think that this is likely a more workable solution for mitigation in some situations, but it has a bunch of the same problems. It's expensive, it's time consuming, and as you move towards sort of large compositional explanations, enumerating all possible explanations becomes intractable. I'm aware of 2 data sets that have multiple explanations right now, and they only have 2 explanations per question, and these are on very tiny compositional problems, so I don't think this will work in general. The third possible solution is sort of, instead of pouring more workers on generating data, can we try and solve it with theory by building better evaluation mechanisms? And this is probably where we need to go long term, but of course it's going to require substantially advancing models of either formal semantics or creating virtual worlds that have some sort of well-defined semantics in them that have computable evaluations in them. And I should sort of mention here that I'm sort of actively working on all 3 of these approaches, sort of betting on all the horses and hoping one of them finishes the race here. So thanks for listening. The huge resource generated for this work is available at cognitiveai.org/explanationbank. And it's a fantastic resource not just for evaluation, but also for training explainable models. And we've been using it in a lot of our recent work. And the data here was also used for a recent shared task in explanation regeneration shown here. Thanks again.